the attendees that were registered. So why don't we get started? All right, great. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us for our last Stimulate the Vote seminar, where we'll be discussing voting power and environmental policy. Our two speakers this afternoon are both revered colleagues from the Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. This center is part of the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering and is focused on research that seeks to build a healthy, equitable, and resilient food system. Our first speaker is Sarah Goldman. Sarah Goldman joined the Center for a Livable Future in 2019 as a senior program coordinator with the Food System Policy Program, following work as an Emerson National Hunger Fellow. As a fellow, Sarah worked on agricultural policy with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and the National Farm to School Network. At Carleton College, Sarah started an agricultural training program for fellow students that allowed them to learn from practitioners on topics ranging from soil health to water quality to business management, while also gaining hands-on farming experience. She's also served as a community organizer in Nicaragua and a student ambassador at the World Expo in Milan, which focused on food and nutrition. At the center, Sarah conducts research and writes reports related to policies and key issue areas such as procurement, nutrition, antibiotic resistance, industrial food animal production, rural development, migrant food chain workers, and more. And our second speaker is Bob Martin, who joined the Center for a Livable Future in 2011 and is the current program director of the Food Policy Program. Bob's extensive expertise in public policy and knowledge of agriculture, environmental, and health issues comes from years spent on Capitol Hill in state legislature, serving for a family farm advocacy group, and Pew Charitable Trust, where he served as a senior officer at the Pew Environment Group following the dissemination of his work as executive director of the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production. Please welcome our two speakers and take it away.
Great, thanks so much for having us. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen, so hopefully this works. Great, can you see the slides?
Yes, we can. Great.
Awesome. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's on the ballot for this election in terms of food system policy. And so I'm going to give you an overview of the importance of elections in determining our food system and especially ag climate change policy. So first I wanted to kind of take a step back and think about the food system more broadly. As you all probably know, the food system is a symptom of many other systems, from housing to income assistance to healthcare. And I wanted to draw attention a little bit to the expiration of the CARES Act, which happened late this summer, and the importance of this expiring piece of legislation. So with the expiration of the CARES Act, there previously was a moratorium on eviction for renters living in homes with federally backed mortgages, which is about a third of American renters. And so that expired in July of this year. There was also previously automatic forbearance on federal student loans, and that also ended early this fall, as well as expanded federal unemployment benefits, which also ended in July. And because of this expiration, currently both the House and Senate are in debates about the next coronavirus relief package. And no legislation has been passed based particularly on partisan politics to replace this legislation. So the House and the Senate have been moving on very different pieces of legislation to replace the CARES Act. The House is working on the HEROES Act, and the Senate is working on the HEALS Act. They're very similar acronyms, but the substance of those policies is really different. And on the anti-hunger front, in terms of SNAP benefits, the House wants to increase SNAP benefits through the HEROES Act, whereas the Senate proposal would decrease federal food assistance and SNAP assistance. On the worker protection front, especially thinking about food systems and food chain workers, the House's proposal would increase provisions that protect workers, whereas the Senate's bill would decrease protections. And when we think about small farmers and some of the legislation that's been put forward and to help small farmers deal with the impacts of COVID, there are some wins for small farmers in terms of federal assistance in the House bill, but not in the Senate bill. And I wanted to mention all of these things just to say that the outcome of the election has a huge impact on which of these provisions and which of these pieces of legislation moves forward, especially when we're thinking about who controls the Senate, because right now the House is primarily controlled by Democrats, whereas the Senate by Republicans, and therefore there's a real gridlock in terms of which piece of legislation moves forward. So hopefully the outcomes of this election will help move more protections forward and bring one of these pieces of legislation to fruition. Before COVID hit, in terms of food system legislation that directly relates to climate change, Shelley Pingree in February of 2020 this year introduced really a landmark piece of legislation that would help the agricultural sector reach net zero emissions with the goal of doing this by 2040. And this piece of legislation, which there's a great summary on this slide, is called the Agriculture Resiliency Act. And this really is for agricultural organizations that are more progressive, the legislation that is going to have a huge change for the agricultural sector in terms of climate change. So as I said before, this piece of legislation has the goal of achieving net zero emissions by 2040, but there are a few specific provisions in this legislation that are particularly interesting and important. So I'm going to mention just a few of those goals briefly. This legislation has a goal of quadrupling total federal funding to food and agricultural research through extension programs. It also wants to restore at least half of the lost soil carbon in the agricultural sector, maintain year-round cover on at least 75% of cropland acres. It also creates an advanced grazing management program and wants to implement this program on all of the grazing lands in the United States and increase the crop and livestock integration over previous levels, especially 2017 levels, and has a really great benchmark of achieving these goals initially, finally by 2040, but at least half of these goals by 2030. So it's a really ambitious piece of legislation, but spells out the specifics of each of these goals. So I wanted to just mention some of the specifics on 4 provisions, as we are at the School of Public Health, which focuses on research and other issues as well. So in terms of research, this legislation would increase funding for the USDA regional climate hubs and invest in public breeds and cultivar research, which would help create new types of crops and livestock that could help mitigate the effects of climate change. The legislation also has really interesting soil health provisions. Right now, one of the huge issues in terms of mitigating risk for small sustainable farmers is access to crop insurance, and this legislation would offer performance-based crop insurance discounts for practices that would reduce risk. So this is a really innovative policy. It also creates a new grant program to improve soil health. and creates a new office for soil health and greenhouse gas, an advisory committee at USDA. The legislation also has really interesting provisions to preserve farmland and farm viability. So it creates a program that helps farmers develop and expand markets for farm products that improve soil quality by expanding a previous program called the Local Agriculture Marketing Program. And it also increases funding for the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program, which is really important for farmers who want to take sustainable management practices to their farms. And finally, in terms of pasture-based livestock, which is a huge source of methane and other greenhouse gas emissions, this legislation would create a new program to reimburse very small meat processors for the cost associated with federal inspection, and establish a new program, which is a Grasslands 30 pilot program, which could help reduce the risk of converting cropping systems and the development of annual payments for grazers. So this was going to be a picture of the legislation as it shows up on the House website, but the picture isn't loading. But I'll just give you a little bit of an update on the status of this legislation. So as I mentioned before, it was introduced on February 2nd of this year, and there are currently 26 co-sponsors for the Ag Resiliency Act, but they all are Democrats. And Jamie Raskin is actually from Maryland, is actually a co-sponsor in this legislation. But in order for this legislation to move forward, there has to be a similar bill introduced in the Senate, and that currently is not the case. And there are a couple of important questions that need to be answered to determine the fate of this legislation, and really will tell which provisions move forward. So the first of those questions is, will the Democrats have control in the Senate to move this legislation forward? As I mentioned before, because the House is controlled by the Democrats and the Senate by Republicans, there's a lot of gridlock now in moving legislation forward. And so hopefully after this election, the Senate will turn over to the Democrats to move this legislation forward. Another question is, will Democrats from the Midwest gain power? A lot of Midwestern representatives are on the Agriculture Committee, and because of that, they have enormous power to move legislation forward. And finally, a big question is, how will priorities shift if there's a new administration? And the answers to these questions will determine to a large extent whether and which of the provisions that I've mentioned will move forward, and if there will be political will to move any of them to the Senate and past the Congress. And so to wrap up, I also wanted to mention that if the administration changes, we could see a drastic policy priority shift. I've listed here just all of Biden's agriculture and conservation programs in bullets, and wanted to elevate a few important policies that are on this list. So on Biden's platform, he has committed to establishing a new voluntary carbon farming market that reward farmers for carbon sequestration and emission reductions. So carbon markets, if Biden wins, are going to be a huge area to look out for in terms of climate and ag policy. His platform also calls for the end of the USDA's historical discrimination against Black farmers in federal farm programs, and to expand protections for farm workers and provide legal status based on prior farm work history, ensure labor and safety rules. So we could likely see, if there's a change in administration, new programs and increased funding for programs that support socially disadvantaged farmers, and also support farm workers. So that's all I've got for you today, and I'll turn it over to Bob Martin for further updates.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Sam, for inviting us to join you today. Just to give a little further bit about my background, in addition to what Sam said in my bio, is I really have more of a political / policy background than public health background. I always tell people that I'm a political hack by training and work experience that has been part of the Center for a Livable Future off and on since 2005, when I left Capitol Hill to run the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production. I've worked, part of my background is I've worked for the last 4 Democratic senators from South Dakota in a policy and political communications position, as well as Dan Glickman when he was a member of Congress from Kansas before he became Secretary of Agriculture in the Clinton administration. So my view is almost always really from a political background. I think that starting in 1996, and I hope I don't get too political, but starting in 1996, really one political party in the country started questioning science, and they did it really based in the climate change debate. And that political party was the Republican Party. And they did so primarily because of their donor class and who they represent, but also as strictly just a counterpoint to growing commentary on the Democratic side about the need to take specific actions to avert a climate disaster. I think that that kind of attitude has really escalated under the Trump administration, with really an across the boards attack on science. I'm going to put a couple of things here in the chat, a couple of links that might be of interest. Hold on just a minute. Sarah's much smoother at presenting than I am. So the first link is really about the across-the-board environmental rollback that's been undertaken by the Trump administration in the last 3.5 years. Most of those rollbacks have come in the areas of environmental safeguards. And I think it has led many of the traditionally nonpartisan or groups that are really quiet in this area to come out for the first time critical of what the administration is doing. Some of those groups are like the journal Nature, the Journal of the American Medical Association. The Union of Concerned Scientists has led efforts to defend science and science discussion in the political realm and in the policy development realm. And so just this morning on CNN, there's the second link that says the US election is really a vote on the science of climate change for the whole world. And I did want to talk about that because all the environmental policy in the country heretofore really was based on scientific investigation and research, and the kind of the wholesale rollback of decades of environmental regulations and policies, really at a breakneck pace, is really unprecedented. And I did want to talk a little bit too about a couple of the things that CLF is involved in. We have a project called the Food Citizen Project that it's a polling project to try to help inform the public debate on different ag policy issues. We have polled on topics as varied as sustainability considerations to be part of the last dietary guidelines, to the regulation of the poultry industry in Maryland, and the last two polls have been national polls with a deep look into Iowa, North Carolina on proposed national moratorium on concentrated animal feeding operations. And I'm going to switch in a minute and try to share my screen with a specific piece of legislation that's been introduced in the House and Senate, focusing on a national moratorium bill proposed by Senator Cory Booker. But I also did want to highlight a couple of links to CLF work. We've done, whoa. Not sure what happened there, but did you guys see the CNN? Oh, okay. We've done also extensive writing and research on the impact of individual dietary choices on greenhouse gas emissions. We have analyzed data from about 150 countries and can predict the carbon footprint of individuals in those countries based on dietary choices. And we've also done work on what protections need to be in place to protect food system workers in COVID, in the times of COVID, primarily in industrial settings. Let's see if I can share my screen now to talk specifically about the bill by Senator Cory Booker. Let's see if this. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes,
okay, so I had mentioned CLF's polling on a proposed national moratorium. And so I'm not really speaking in jargon. CAFOs are concentrated animal feeding operations, which are large-scale animal operations that combine large numbers of animals in a confined setting. And they're animals of the same species. They're confined with little natural movement. Excuse me, many times animals are fed low levels of antibiotics to get them through the production system without coming down with a bacterial or microbial infection. Senator Booker has been interested in a national moratorium on these operations, mainly because of environmental justice reasons. And the Farm System Reform Act was introduced in late 2019. The Congress is organized, and you may know this, so I apologize if this is not new information, but is organized around the election of the House of Representatives. So every 2 years, a new Congress is initiated. In that 2-year period, there's a first and a second session. Any bill that is not passed by the end of the second session of Congress has to be reintroduced in the subsequent Congress. So this bill will need to be reintroduced in January, as will its companion bill in the House by Representative Ro Khanna of California. So Senator Booker's bill would place an immediate moratorium on new and expanding CAFOs and phase out the largest category of concentrated animal feeding operations by 2040. Right now, CAFOs are permitted through the Clean Water Act, which is administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. So the definition of size is really based in EPA regulatory statutes. Other aspects of the bill would be hold corporate integrators responsible for pollution and other harm caused by CAFOs. Right now, they're exempt from the Clean Air Act, and the permitting through the Clean Water Act is not as rigorous as it should be. It's kind of like an omnibus bill, really. It has many parts that address systemic issues. So It provides for a voluntary buyout for farmers who want to transition out of the industrial operation. Many times, because of contracting structures, it's hard for producers once they get into a industrial style of production. It's hard for them to break out of that debt cycle. So this would provide some transition assistance. The Packards and Stockyards Act governs the slaughter of animals in the United States, and the Farm System Reform Act would prohibit the use of tournament or ranking systems to pay contract producers. That's primarily done in poultry production. And what it does is it kind of pits neighbors against one another, and your production is not really, or your payment is not really based on how well you do as an individual, but it's based on how you perform in competition with your neighbors. That might seem like it's an all right system, but where it is really unfair is that, especially in the poultry industry, the large companies really have a strong impact on how you'll perform, because it's been proven or shown that if you're a producer that questions the contracting system or criticizes the company you're raising birds for, they'll provide you with a lower quality of bird in your subsequent cycles of raising poultry, and it's a 47-day cycle. So you kind of are at the mercy of the large companies. It would also protect livestock and poultry farmers from retaliation. Many times when a producer criticizes the company, they will be retaliated against. There's also retaliation if producers talk to one another and start forming production alliances or try to cooperate with one another. They'll be retaliated against. Sometimes they'll lose their ongoing contracts with the company. And like I said, it's about every 47 days, but the investment a producer makes in his or her operation, it's a long-term situation, so it may take a decade or longer to pay off your debt, but you're at a 47-day cycle interval of the companies. A couple of the other aspects that aren't really climate oriented but are very important to producers is restore mandatory country of origin labeling for beef and pork, and prohibit USDA from labeling foreign meat products as product of the USA, which is now permissible under current law. So I want to show just one more slide about the process. There we go. So the center was involved pretty strongly in the process for developing the Farm System Reform Act. This is the basic outline of a sequence of events that Senator Booker visited North Carolina and was really concerned about the environmental justice aspects of swine production there. Most swine operations most industrial animal operations are located in lower income rural areas in North Carolina in particular. They're located near communities of color that historically don't have much power or influence in their state policy. So he was really appalled at what he was seeing, and starting in 2017, soon after Earth Justice, which was affiliated with the Columbia Environmental Law Lab, they were the ones that took Senator Booker to North Carolina. They convened a group to develop the Farm System Reform Act over a couple-year period. Our first national poll on a moratorium was in fall of 2019, and it showed strong support across the boards, across the political spectrum, for a national moratorium, and fairly strong support in Iowa and North Carolina too, where we did a deep look. CLF was really the lead group on updating the American Public Health Association's moratorium on concentrated animal feeding operations in November of 2019. And I think our polling helped influence that a bit. And our poll with the APHA moratorium really, I think, got Senator Booker kind of over the finish line to introduce his bill. So I know this has been a little bit of a scattershot presentation about industrial farm animal production and some of this attacks on science going on in politics now. But I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, you two, for sharing those slides and those really important pieces of information about the pieces of legislation and other policy that that are on the line this election. So we've had some questions that were submitted beforehand, and so one of those is just a general question. Are there opportunities for Masters of Public Health students to become more involved in environmental policy projects through the Center for a Livable Future?
Well, we'll both take a shot at that. My short answer is yes. We have research associate positions, research assistant positions that we have through the school year and the summer. The potential work that a student can do is advertised on the center's website. There's also opportunities. We have a couple of folks at the center, Dr. Ronnie Neff and Dr. Keith Nackman, that teach courses at the School of Public Health. And there are opportunities that arise there too. So I think the best thing to do is to kind of watch on the on the center's website when we publish what our research projects are going to be. We do that, I think the summer ones come out maybe in February or March. So yes, there are opportunities.
Yeah, I would just add to what Bob has said. Everything he said is great. And I think the RA opportunity is the primary way to work directly with us. We also do advise capstones within the center. So if you're interested in focusing your studies on food system related issues, we do have an education program that publishes all different potential capstone projects. And then also I usually, when I'm talking to MPH students or School of Public Health students, urge you all to really take ownership for where you are right now in your studies at Johns Hopkins, which is the leading public health school. And I think in our advocacy work, the people really look to us for cutting edge public health and food systems research. And even though you're a student or on faculty or staff, your voice really matters in policy discussions. And there are always ways to weigh in the process, whether that be through submitting written testimony or oral comment on any program. Often in the rulemaking process, it's required by law that when new rules are developed, they have to be open for public comment. And so as a student, I'd urge you to take advantage of that opportunity as well and provide your feedback.
One thing I'd add on, and Sarah's exactly right about the capstones that MPH students have to do. We've actually advised 4 or 5 capstones over the last few years, and some of those have been actually developed into white papers for the center. So a student's capstone paper might, it's usually a different length and need some rewriting, but you really get double duty out of your capstone work if it's adopted by the center as a white paper, and we've done that several times.
Cool. Such wonderful opportunities and points that you both made. Okay, so one of the couple questions that I had come up with that were a little bit more more specific to the material that you both presented on. So if you can, could you speak on the federal policy or sort of the politics around this trade war with China and sort that and sort of go into how that trickles down to affect like local policy, farmers, the agricultural markets. Just sort of give us a taste of what that really means for the local farmers and what's going on in everyone's communities.
Sure, I think we can both speak to that. I mean, I think U.S. ag policy over the years has really been changed from um, a U.S. market focus to a worldwide market focus, and we basically took away environmentally sound production controls to take care of the land, help manage nutrient flow, help rebuild the soil, to basically raising absolutely everything we can, hoping we'd find an export market. Trade agreements kind of can exacerbate that. The North American Free Trade Agreement really changed or escalated agriculture into a direction that it was already starting to go, and it's really been disruptive for the whole Western Hemisphere. As far as China, there is such a strong growing demand for pork in China, and some of it's based on the improvement in the Chinese economy and the increase in the standard of living of many people in China, that it's really become that we raise a significant amount of pork for direct export to China, and a significant amount of our soybeans are raised as an export to China to feed their domestic production. So we're not only providing slaughtered animals and export, and we're also providing a significant amount of their feed grains. And so what happens when you start a tariff war? That has a strongly negative effect on the worldwide price of a commodity. And it has really pushed the price of the commodities received down because of the uncertainty of the market. And because China is replacing some of the domestic production, domestic US production, with production from places like Brazil, which obviously has climate impacts because forests are being cleared to increase soybean production in Brazil. So it has that downward price push when one of our major buyers is no longer allowed to buy. And but a farmer's expenses, I mean, they're on a different sort of a cycle, right? They were planning for next year's crop a while ago, and so when that's disrupted, their expenses don't go away, and you see instead of a government program that kind of controls production and helps farmers get a price from the market, one of wide open production on corn and soybeans, and basically hoping you find a foreign buyer for them. Their expenses keep going on. Their debt is not reduced because they've lost a foreign market, and so you see about $30 billion in subsidies to make up for that lost income overseas. I don't know if that answered the question or not. And
Yes, that definitely did. Thank you so much for explaining that. I think that was a really insightful way to really sum up the issue. So thank you.
yeah.
All right, Sarah, did you have anything to add, or should we move on?
I think that was a great answer. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, great. All right, so Bob, you brought up a really important theme in this year's election cycle, the attack on science. So how do you think, as public health students and just as STEM students in general at Hopkins, how can we get more involved in either research or say local or state policy to try to kind of alter this dangerous path rejecting science.
Yeah, Sarah gave some good points about that earlier about being involved, looking for opportunities as students. CLF is not the only research center in the school, and I mean, I would speak to professors. There was an effort. I don't think it was just EHE to organize people to actually go to Washington a couple of times on days to protest the attack on science. So I do think you have to be just kind of open-minded and a little bit creative about making your voice heard. Organizations or efforts like this group are important. Look for opportunities to speak out. There's no reason why you couldn't, as a group, try to write letters to the editor or write letters to the members of the Maryland legislature or the Maryland delegation in DC. I think Sarah said something really, very good too. Opportunities to testify before the legislature in Maryland. We are regularly part of efforts like that. Anytime there's a rulemaking, she was exactly right that there's a requirement for public comments. And so it's just, I think, being kind of creative and taking advantage of those opportunities. If there's an area you're specifically interested in, like the dietary guidelines, I mean, I think we can help you sort through the labyrinth of federal regulations that govern some of these, or if there are other areas you might be interested in. Sarah's very thoughtful, so I know she'll have some added things to say too.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the attack on science at the federal level is really blatant and makes me pessimistic often, but that doesn't mean that at the state level and the local level, people aren't listening to the advice, especially at Hopkins that has a reputation for accurate science and now building community-based research as well. And so I would urge you at the local level, especially as we're getting into the Maryland legislative session that starts in January, to take advantage and follow that process as well, because often at the state level, it's a lot easier to be in contact directly with your legislators and the folks who represent you. And there are opportunities always to testify. And often there are working groups that are the ones crafting legislation at the local level. And so there are often opportunities for you to join working groups as students, to volunteer with legislators who want to address specific areas of interest. And so that's an opportunity to really both testify, but also weigh in on the legislation crafting process.
That's an excellent point to get to know, because I think Sarah's actually done this on her own, has gotten to know her Baltimore City representative in Annapolis. And I think once you develop that relationship, they'll listen to you.
Great. Thank you so much for those points. And I think you really made it clear that, we all have to have a voice, and we all really have to kind of go out of our comfort zone to really see change and engage with sort of the state and local legislators to be able to make a difference.
One thing, because of my background working in political offices too, a lot of times, for example, every member of the federal legislature will have an office in their district. Or if they're a senator, they'll have several offices in different communities in their state. It's really good to get to know those state staff people too. A lot of times, I mean, I know it's exciting to go to Washington and be part of the legislative day on the Hill. But in my experience, there are very knowledgeable people on the state and city staffs or district staffs of members of the U.S. House and Senate. And a lot of times, every office I'd been a part of, the technical staff, legislative staff on the Hill would be linked with a corresponding person back in the district or the state, because those are the people that are face to face with the public every day. And it's not so much an issue in Maryland because it is so easy to get to DC, and Maryland senators and representatives employ so many people from Maryland and are home a lot. But getting to know local staff people can be very helpful too.
Great. Okay, so now switching to some of the policies that that you both spoke on. So, what would you each consider, say, a short-term and then a long-term legislative win for sustainable food systems?
I can go first. I think the short term is easier for me to think of than the long term, but in the short term, there's an urgent need for a new coronavirus relief package. As I was saying before, social determinants of health, social determinants of food security are on the line right now. We're seeing the highest rates of hunger we've seen in years currently, because there's just a lack of assistance by the government to really care for the most vulnerable population. So a relief package right now would do incredible things to help the folks who most need it currently. I think in terms of long-term food systems change, there are a number of pieces of legislation that could help. As I mentioned in my slides, the Ag Resiliency Act is a really great way to help producers who are taking an alternative approach and embracing sustainable agriculture be more viable on the market. But also kind of there's that incentive approach, but also there needs to be accountability for practices that are doing harm. So the CAFO moratorium that Bob is mentioning is important to make sure that practices that exploit workers, exploit the environment, and exploit the animals that are being cogs in the machine, so to speak, are really having to pay for and address the consequences of their actions is also important.
Yeah, I would agree with the COVID relief packages, and the analysis or the comparison Sarah did was excellent. I think there'll be something. I mean, kind of the way the rhythm works. There might be another COVID relief package in the lame duck session after the election. I think if the Democrats take control of the Senate and maintain control of the House and win the presidency, I think you'll see a lot of behind the scenes work being done in December for something even more massive, broad scale or broad perspective relief to be done early in a new administration. I think a couple of long-term things. We're working on a new round of dietary guideline recommendations right now. I think they're going to be done, I think, in about a year. The sustainability debate around dietary guidelines is not happening this year. It's focused more on nutritional issues between birth and 24 months. But when they're done this time, the groundwork will be starting to be laid for the next dietary guidelines in 4 years. The next farm bill is 2023. A lot of groups are already working on that, and so that's where some of the agricultural reform act that Sarah was talking about will be discussed in the context of a broader farm bill. So I think moving those key or core programs of the farm bill from rewarding overproduction to maybe a system that builds soil health and returns a better income to producers. I've got a personal long term that I would love to see that doesn't. People are going to say, "What? How does this affect the environment?" I would love to see very aggressive enforcement of the antitrust laws in the country, because I think if you look at one of the the threads that runs through a lot of the political problems or opposition to a more sustainable system. It's the power of the corporate interest in the country that have a food production system exactly like they want now.
Yep, that is such a great point, Bob. And thank you both for such an great answers, as always. Okay, and so I think we have time for one more question. So this is one of our attendees' questions. So just to kind of wrap everything up, and you might have also already partially answered this, but how do we combine the themes of climate change and food insecurity, and what are some of those, or what are some potential opportunities that we as students can engage in?
I'll let Sarah answer first.
That's a good question. Well, I think more generally, I'll go a little bit of a philosophic route. And I was mentioning this when we were talking about CAFO style production, but currently systems that often harm the environment, harm human health, and harm anti-hunger communities as well. So take the CAFO system as an example. We've done a lot of work at CLF looking at CAFO style production in North Carolina, and the folks who are living and working in those facilities are suffering environmental justice concerns through contamination, through environmental waste due to the facilities themselves. So often what you see is exploitative systems that exploit the environment, also exploit people, and create food production systems that aren't benefiting or feeding the country in the way that really would sustain them. So a lot of times when I'm thinking about food systems and resilience, I'm thinking about a sustainable style of production that benefits the land and the people generally who are utilizing that system.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. And it was a very good question too. It does kind of remind me of like our very, very broad description of what's wrong with the system in the Pew Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production final report called Putting Meat on the Table. And we said that the current system represents an unacceptable level of damage to the environment, an unacceptable level of threat to public health, is harmful to the animals housed in the system, and depresses economic activity in the communities in which they're housed. And I think that we haven't done much to reform the system in the last 12 years since the Pew report came out, and so that still kind of resonates with me. Maybe it's I don't know, pride of authorship, because I actually wrote that that broad description of the system. I think Dr. Marion Nestle at NYU, and actually a lot of reform activists say you can vote 3 times a day about the food system you want. So it's learn about the current food system and work for change, but by your regular actions and how you purchase food and how you consume food is like the first act you can do. We have a project that we advise, or the National Science Advisor for a project called Meatless Monday, and it's amazing. There are benefits to that one small step you can take for your own health and for the planet's health.
Great. Well, Sarah and Bob, thank you both so much for your time and for your presentations. It's such, food systems is such an important topic, and truly reaches across the range of almost every type of policy that can be developed in pieces of legislature that can go through. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our attendees that joined us this afternoon. And just your last minute reminder that tomorrow is election day. So if you have not already mailed in your ballot or early voted, tomorrow is the day. So please go out and vote. Thank you so much for joining us. And Sarah and Bob, I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much again. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Bye, guys. Take care. Bye, everyone.